Hey there, welcome to the Bible in 5. This is part 2 of the book of Matthew. So you recall from last time in reading through the book of Matthew, Matthew is trying to tell the story of Jesus as the fulfillment or the continuation of the storyline of the Old Testament. And so Matthew portrays Jesus as Israel's new Moses or Israel's new teacher. And so he concludes all of the main sections. He's broken up the story of Jesus into 5 main parts here. And he concludes every one with a long block of Jesus' teachings. And so the storyline so far is Jesus came onto the scene announcing the kingdom. It wasn't what people expected. And he came with power and authority, but Israel's leaders in chapters 11 through 13, they reject Jesus. They're suspicious of him. They think he's a false Messiah leading the people astray. And so the main question on your mind then is what's going to happen? Why is so much of Israel rejecting Jesus and so on? And so in these next chapters, chapters 14 through 20, Jesus begins to teach his closest ring of disciples about the true meaning of what it means for him to be the Messiah. He says it's not going to be about him coming to kick out the Romans and kill all the Gentiles. Rather, he begins to hit on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who saw that the Messiah would suffer and die for the sins of Israel, not conquer Israel's enemy, but rather conquer sin and death itself. And so he begins to try and tell his disciples that he's going to have to die. He's going to have to be a servant who lays down his life for Israel and the nations. And the disciples are clueless. They don't get it. They don't have categories for this. And so they perpetually misunderstand Jesus, and they perpetually misunderstand what the kingdom of God is really all about, the kingdom that Jesus is bringing. And so Jesus has to teach them what it means to be the Messiah, but also what it means to be the Messiah's followers. In their mind, following the Messiah is going to mean glory and fame and power. And Jesus is saying, no, the way God is at work, the kingdom of God means none of those things. So he has to reshape their values. He's trying to teach them that actually loving your enemies instead of killing them is what God is about. He has to teach them that forgiving people who wrong you instead of getting revenge is the way God works. He has to teach them that serving people, getting underneath them and seeking their well-being is the way to actually be the first in God's kingdom. And so that's what Jesus does here in these chapters 18 through 20. He's showing what it means to be a community of the followers of Jesus. And his disciples still really don't get it, but he's trying. And all of it leads to the culmination of the last chapters here. Jesus goes to Jerusalem during the week of Passover, the most packed week, packed with the most symbolic meaning. It retold the story, the Passover, of Israel's exodus, of God's redemption, of his people from slavery. And so Jesus marches into Jerusalem, on the donkey. It's a famous scene. And people are hailing him as Israel's Messiah, and he accepts it. But then he marches right into the temple, and he begins to turn over the tables. And what he's doing in that scene is he is symbolically, just like Jeremiah or Ezekiel did symbolic acts to show that God was going to judge the temple. Jesus is marching into the temple, stopping the sacrifices from happening, turning the tables over, and he's symbolically pronouncing judgment on the temple. What he's saying is that Israel, as it exists right now, has forfeited its role. It's given up its role to be a witness to the nations. And he begins to talk about he is Israel's true Messiah who's going to have to give up his life to be Israel's true servant in place of Israel. And so what happens then is Jesus begins, again, he takes his followers aside and teaches them about what's going to happen. He's going to die. There's going to be a great judgment that falls upon the people of Israel. The temple itself is going to be destroyed. And Jesus tries to encourage them, but yet on the other side of this act of judgment, he's going to return, and he's going to set up his kingdom over all nations. And so all of this is ringing in the disciples' ears as the passion of Jesus begins. And Jesus is arrested on claims of being a false Messiah, of claiming to be the king of God's people, of claiming to be the Son of God. And so he's killed, he's executed by the Romans, and everything that happens to him is precisely, Matthew's showing you, the fulfillment of what the prophets said would happen. The Messiah would come, and he would absorb into himself the pain and the death and the sin of Israel and also of all nations. And so that comes to a close in chapter 27 as Jesus is buried. And the book ends with a strange and surprising conclusion of the empty tomb and of people seeing Jesus alive in a physical body, or alive from the dead. And this is the fulfillment of the whole storyline of the book, and Matthew is trying to tell us of the whole storyline of what God has been up to in the Bible all along. That the servant Messiah would come and conquer death, absorb sin into himself, and then in his new resurrection life, Jesus sends out the disciples to proclaim the message of good news, that sin has been dealt with, death has been conquered, and it's announcing the good news, and that all nations can now turn to Jesus in faith and accept the new thing that God is doing in the kingdom of God. So that's the shape of Matthew's story. He's telling you that this is what God has been doing throughout the whole Old Testament leading up to the cross and the resurrection. And from here, the disciples go out, and they go out to begin the Jesus movement. But before we get to that, in the book of Acts, we have a few more retellings of the story of Jesus to get to. So I hope that's helpful for you. We'll see you in the next Bible in 5.